Hello everybody, I'm Nora Burrows. Today I want to make a new quilt for my clothesline. I had hung a clothesline in my yard right out by the roads that people who are walking or driving by can see the quilt and hopefully it brings them a little bit of interest, maybe even a little bit of joy. It's supposed to be kind of like a piece of art even in the yard that I can then bring inside and snuggle with. But the last quilt that I hung out there, which is also the only quilt I've ever hung out there, was these bright colors. I used all of my most brightly colored scraps to make this quilt. It's really fun. I wanted people to be able to see it from super far away. This quilt that I want to make for the clothesline is going to be kind of the opposite. It's going to be a lot of neutral colors, a lot of browns, dark tans, that kind of thing. And it's going to be Civil War reprint fabrics. So this quilt is going to be a Black Lives Matter quilt. I wanted to say Black Lives Matter. So instead of having a yard sign that says Black Lives Matter, I want to have this big, beautiful quilt that says Black Lives Matter. I want it to have these beautiful intricate borders, layered borders, so that you have kind of these stark letters, these stark words that say Black Lives Matter, and then the surrounding borders just to be really intricate and detailed and beautiful, and I have some great fabrics for that. Now, it is not lost to me, and it is even very intentional, that the fabrics that I'm going to be using, these Civil War recreation fabrics, because what was happening in the early to mid 1800s, well, there was a lot of slaves picking cotton, and because they were picking cotton, there was an abundance of fabric, and with this abundance of fabric, the fabric prices lowered, people had more access to it, women were able to make more quilts, they had more choices in fabric, things like that. And so this quilt is a little bit of a statement in that it's kind of screaming out to the women of the Civil War era saying, Black Lives Matter. These people who are out in the fields picking the cotton, allowing you to create these beautiful quilts, their lives matter. Now, race is always an uncomfortable topic for me to talk about because I am concerned I'm going to say the wrong thing, that I'm not going to articulate myself in the way that I would like to. I'm sure even in this very short opening that there will be some controversy and I may have said something the wrong way. So, but I think a little bit of discomfort in talking about race is normal. But aside from that discomfort, I really want to express in my art or in this quilt that Black Lives Matter to me. So let's do that. Let's get started. I want to show you the fabric that I'm going to use. This is going to be my background fabric right here. Lovely little floral print. And then the letters on top are going to be this lovely fabric here. So hopefully that contrast between the background and the letters will be enough that those letters will really pop right off of the quilt. The way that I'm going to do the letters is I'm going to use this book here, and I have never used this book. I just got this book, so I cannot recommend it yet, but I'll let you know how I like it. So as you can see, this book shows you, here, let me open it up and you can see one of the letters. So for example, like here's Q, right? So it shows you how to make this letter Q block, and it has it for sizes, block sizes 6 and 12. We're gonna make the 6-inch blocks. But if you don't have this book, there's a variety of ways to make letters for quilt blocks. I would say the most common one is probably applique. So you can either use a stencil or just draw out the letters and then applique it right on to the fabric. Or you could get a fabric marker or fabric paint and you could on the fabric write out whatever letters or words that you'll be using in your quilt. But let's start making the letters and then we'll add the border. It's a couple days later and I have finished my letter blocks. These were incredibly easy. I highly recommend the book. Let me see if I can find it. Where is it? Here it is. This is by Lori Holt. I don't know Lori Holt, but this book is fantastic. So it has the capital letters, lowercase letters, punctuation marks. It even has some fun blocks in the back, like it has a bee and I think an apple, that kind of thing. So this book was fantastic. The instructions were incredibly easy. These blocks you could knock, I think I made 16 blocks. You could knock these out in an afternoon, no problem. So let me lay these out. Let's take a look and we'll talk about next steps. Here are the blocks laid out, and I think they're looking pretty good. But I think that the fabrics came out really, really nice together. So the darker one and the lighter one, both kind of this floral print, came out beautiful. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing that will make them look even better is that, for example, this bee, you'll see that there's kind of like this notch here. But when you have the seam allowance, that will become nice and crisp. And then I'm thinking that I will do my binding in this, because I always like a dark binding. In front of each letter, I have sewn a 2-inch strip. So you can see here, attached to the A is a strip, and attached to the T is a strip. So there's a strip on the right-hand side of each letter, except for the beginning and ending letters where there's 2 strips. So you see for the M, I have a 2-inch strip on the front of the M and on the back of the M. Now, the word matter has 1 more letter than the words black and lives. So on the end of the S for lives, I have a 5-inch strip. Same with the K, the B, and the L. Now, what's going to be a little bit tricky is that I think I didn't measure totally correctly. So if you can see over here, I should have left more than 5 inches on the edges of black and lives, because I think once I sew these together, I'll need more space over here. So I'm just going to sew the letters together, and then I will decide if maybe I need to seam rip the ends of these off and attach a bigger piece, but I may not. So what I'm going to do is chain piece these together, which means I will attach the A to the M, the T to the T, and the R to the E. And I will just sew these right one after another. Same with all of the letters, B to L, A to C, L to I, V to E, and then I'll have to attach the K and the S later, but I'll just sew them on my sewing machine one after the other, which will make this go quickly. So now I've sewn my pairs. You can see these are sewn together. And next I will sew these 2 together, these 2 together, these 2 together, and then I'll press all that and then add on these pieces over here, so I'll have 3 rows. Just as I suspected, these end pieces next to the B, the L, and the K and the S on the other side are not long enough, so you see that the seam would come right down with the M, and I don't want to be sewing those together on top of a seam here. So what I'm going to do is take these pieces off the end, make them wider, and then the next step will be to cut strips of background fabric to go in between the words. It has been a little while since we last checked in. I am not gonna lie, it's been more than a couple days, but I have been working consistently on this quilt. The problem is, and why it's taking so long, is I keep making things for it and then deciding I want to go in a different direction. So let's touch base about, what's happened since last time we checked in. I attached strips in between the words and also along the top and the bottom, and then obviously I added on this border here. I want to show you the border because I think it's really pretty. Look at this fabric. It's kind of like this charcoal gray, but I think it goes really nicely with the colors in this quilt, and it's just kind of sophisticated and clean cut. So where this quilt is now, I'm actually really happy with it. But I have been struggling a little bit with where to go from here. So for example, I made all of these half square triangles attached in a row, and I made so many of these. I mean, like, look at these strips. I practically have enough to go like all the way around this quilt. I made so many. And my thought was I would attach them kind of along the edges here. And let me get you a closer view of how this would look. Here are these pretty strips, and seeing them here, I actually don't dislike this so much. I think initially I felt like it was a little bit busy, and I wanted to kind of keep the focus on the text, but I don't hate this. I'm just not sure. I'm being really indecisive about this quilt at this point. The other thing I did was I made these dove quilt blocks, which I thought were so appropriate for this quilt. You know, the dove representing peace, I thought was just completely perfect for a Black Lives Matter quilt. But I'm not in love with how these came out. I was thinking that I was gonna have these be cornerstones, you know, have one of these in each corner, kind of like that. But there's something about it that just doesn't really go with the quilt to me. And with the seam allowance, you know, some of this dove will get cut off in the seam allowance. So I'm thinking I might use this on the back of the quilt. Then it occurred to me that I had this really cool fabric here, and I had kind of been avoiding this fabric because I wasn't in love with the pink in it. I just didn't feel like it went. I thought about it and I thought, you know, this stripe kind of down the middle here is really nice. This is not actually a Civil War recreation fabric like the other fabrics that I'm using are. This is a French General, which I think they make fabric that's kind of supposed to look like it's from that time period, but this is not a recreation. But that's okay. But I did cut this strip out of that fabric that I just showed you, and I thought maybe I could put it, you know, along each one of the sides, and then I could still have some kind of cornerstone in each corner. Let me get you a closer look of that. Here's how this would look, and I actually don't dislike this either. Again, I'm just kind of in this place of not knowing what's best. The other thing that occurred to me was that I could make this the cornerstone, kind of just cut this piece out of the strip and put one of these in each of the four corners, and then kind of visually secure it with these brown strips on either side. And this fabric here is the same fabric that's in the letters over here, which I think is kind of cool and ties it together nicely. Then what I could do is use this fabric here to kind of be the border coming down, and I could even put my half square triangles kind of coming down the center there. Now this is super busy, so that's something to think about. Is this just too much? However, I mean, this is a dramatic border, right? And it could be kind of cool to have the stark, bold Black Lives Matter words in the middle and then kind of have this dramatic border. I'm gonna cut out the cornerstones, kind of start cutting out some of these pieces and just see how I feel about it. My quilt top is finished and I am so happy with how this came out. I did the borders a little bit differently than I'd said I was going to. I put my half square triangle strips right against the edge of this sashing piece here instead of in the middle of this strip, and then use the same fabric for this outer border as I did for part of the half square triangle here. I was actually going to make this part reach all the way to the cornerstones, but I didn't have enough of this fabric here, so I added those, and I think that's great. So next I need to make the quilt backing. And I don't have a ton of fabric left over, actually. One of the things I know I want to do for the quilt backing is use the fabric that I used in the background here. I want to use that in the center of the quilt backing. So let's see how much of that we have. So we have enough to cover the words, which is what I want. And I'll tell you why. Because the quilt that I have currently hanging outside is my Mary Fawn's quilt, which I love, and I can't wait to bring that inside once we put the Black Lives Matter quilt outside. But that quilt, what I've noticed is because it's hanging and the light is shining through it, even though there's batting in the middle, you can sometimes see the seams from the back of the quilt on the front of the quilt and the seams from the front of the quilt on the back of the quilt, depending on what direction you're looking. And I don't want to be able to see any seams coming through onto the front of the Black Lives Matter. I don't want any distractions. I want to really just be able to see those words and those letters. So I want to make sure to have this light colored full panel with no seams. So I have enough here, which is great. And then besides that, I really just have kind of bits and pieces here. I have, you know, a little bit of this fabric, the same one, just a bit. I have some strips of this. I have probably a 1/4 yard left of this. So I'm gonna start piecing some of these together. The other thing I have for the back is my dove block, which I wanna make sure to use. Last night I started piecing a bunch of little pieces together. So for example, for the dove block, this is kind of funny, but I had to do so many trials of that dove block that I ended up with all of these kind of rectangle, triangle pieces in all different sizes. These were the wings of the dove. Because it's a long story, but the pattern I had was for foundation piecing and I didn't want to do it that way. So I was kind of trying to make up my own pattern, but look at how many I made of this. This is part of why this quilt has taken me so long, because I spent so much time on that dove because I was really committed to that dove being the cornerstones. So I sewed these ones together to make a little strip. The cornerstones of the front, which obviously they didn't end up being because I just didn't love how the dove came out. So I sewed these together last night. So these were all in doubles and I kind of sewed them all together. So I have a gazillion of these that I can use on the back if I want to. I don't have to. And I also have a bunch of these half square triangle strips that I just didn't need as many as I thought for the border going around the outside of the quilt. So I can use these on the back. Last night I just kind of sewed some of my random little scraps together from what I had left over on the front of the quilt. So I sewed some of these pieces together. This one. So these are all pieces that if I need to use them on the back, then I can, but I don't have to. This is kind of a nice long strip here that I put together. This is just a 3-piece and another 3-piece here. And I like these. I think that this is going to be a lot of fun. This is actually one of the parts of the process that I like the most, is figuring out where these little bits and pieces work, because I actually don't have enough of the fabric to just do, you know, like 2 strips on the back or something like that. I do need to piece these pieces together, which is fun and exactly what I love to do. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that and let's see what we come up with. My quilt back is done and wow, I am obsessed with this. I love this just as much as the front, if not more. It has kind of like a little bit of this modern twist, but in kind of this old school way. I don't know. I'm really, really happy with this. I think it's one of the best things I ever made. This backing, I'm obsessed with it. These little half squares or rectangles, half square rectangle things around that I had initially made for the dove. It's almost like I made them specifically for this backing. They're so cool on this quilt back. I'm thrilled that I messed up so many times on that dove so that I had all of those little pieces to put together for the back and just all these little scrappiness around. So I need to now make my quilt sandwich. I went ahead and made a label for this quilt. It's actually the first label I have ever made for a quilt. I need to go back and label all of not only the quilts that I've made, but the quilts that have been given to me. I've realized as I've become interested in quilt history, the importance of labeling your quilt, just like somebody would, you know, sign their art, for example. So I find it's important to put your name, where it was made, and if it was given as a gift, what the occasion was. And what I used to write on this quilt is this pen. It's an archival pen, but it is waterproof, chemical resistant, fade resistant, bleed free, quick drying, and pH neutral. So this should be pretty good. I actually did write over each one of the words 2 times to make sure it's nice and visible. And now I'm going to sew this onto the back of my quilt, and I'm just going to top stitch it. You could do something where, you know, if you pretend this is your label, to iron down the edges and then top stitch so that you have a nice clean edge. But I'm going to actually leave this just raw edge and sew it right on top towards the bottom of the back of the quilt. My quilt is sandwiched together, so I used adhesive spray to secure the front to the batting and then the back all together. And then I did some stitch in the ditch to permanently secure the front, the batting, and the back. So for the stitch in the ditch, what I did is I kind of just, for the lettering, would stitch a little bit on each bit of every letter, but I wouldn't outline the letter. I would just kind of do some lines, and then I did a stitch along the top and the bottom of each word, and then more stitching kind of in random places within the border. So I then put my binding on. I sewed my binding. Let me see if I can get a little piece for you here so you can see. So I used the machine to sew the binding to the quilt, right this. So this was a 2.5 strip. I put it in half and then I sewed it to the machine. Now I'm hand sewing the binding to the back. So I sewed this to the front and then I flipped it over and now I'm sewing it, hand sewing it onto the back. Let me see if I can show you a piece that's done. And I'm using these binding clips, which I love, to kind of keep everything secure as I sew along. So here's some that's done, right there. So I'm close. I'm just gonna finish sewing up this binding, hand sewing this binding, and then we'll hang it on the clothesline. My quilt is done. The binding is all finished. I used the same fabric for the binding that I did for the letters on the words, and I do love a dark binding. I just think it makes it look nice and crisp. Let's go ahead and take the Mary Fonz quilt down. We'll put the Black Lives Matter quilt up. I'll bring the Mary Fonz quilt inside, and I'm excited to have that. I'll give it a nice washing, and I'm excited to have that inside because it's been outside so long that I haven't really gotten a chance to enjoy it. And I do have a video series on making this, but let's put the Black Lives Matter quilt up. Here it is. I'm really, really so proud of this quilt. It is by far the best thing I've ever made, and I can't actually imagine making anything better than this. If you had told me at the beginning of the year that, you know, in this year I would be making the best thing I've ever made, I would be like, wow, I can't believe that, but it's true. I made it. This is the best thing I ever made. I think it's the best thing I will ever make. I am so proud of this. I just feel deep, deep pride in this quilt, in this project. I love it. I think it's beautiful. The borders came out better than I could have imagined. The back of the quilt came out better than I imagined. I'll take the video camera and get a close-up look here and on the back, but I also took some pictures that I'll post at the end of this video. So here we go. I'll just get you a little bit closer so that you can see kind of the details of the cornerstones and some of the border here. And like I mentioned, I did the stitch in the ditch along the top and then the bottom of each word. And then I'll take you around the back as well. The dove is a particular favorite of mine. I think it's perfect exactly where it is. I'm glad I didn't put it on the front. I think it's right there. It's supposed to be in the back, and it allowed me to make all those other little pieces that I was so frustrated with at the time, but so thankful for now. And then obviously I have the label at the bottom. So thank you so much for joining me in making this quilt. I always appreciate it when you come along with me in these processes of making things, but this one in particular means a lot to me, and I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.